Essendon won the VFL's first pennant by winning 1-8 to 8 points. The league's first major upset occurred in 1900 when St Kilda chalked up its first triumph after 48 successive defeats. Although the match finished in a draw, the Saints were awarded the match after successfully protesting that one of Melbourne's behinds was kicked after the three-quarter time bell. 1900 turned out to be the year of the Melbourne Football Club, who prevented Fitzroy from winning its third consecutive premiership. 3 years later, on May the 23rd, 1903, the VFL undertook its first invasion of Sydney in an attempt to promote the game interstate. 18,000 keen fans watched the game at the SCG when Fitzroy met Collingwood for premiership points. The match created another first too. The players wore numbers on their Guernseys. In 1908, Victoria stamped its authority on Australian rules football by winning the inaugural National Football Carnival. The same year saw the admittance to the competition of Richmond and University, to bring to 10 the number of VFL teams. While the new teams proved to be a talking point early in the season, the interest quickly subsided as the populace concentrated on the all-conquering Carlton, which won 19 of its 20 matches. And by beating Essendon by 9 points in the grand final, the club became the first VFL team to win a hat-trick of premierships. Despite Carlton's dominance, the club was hit by internal trouble in 1909 when the players became disenchanted with coach Jack Worrell, and they boycotted training. Worrell, the VFL's first appointed coach, eventually resigned when it was made clear the players wanted captain Fred Elliott as their leader. Despite this strife, the Carlton team reached the grand final again to set up the possibility of its fourth flag on the trot. But South Melbourne, playing in its first grand final, wasn't overawed and won the match by 2 points in front of a 36,000-strong crowd. South ignored the physical clashes and instead concentrated on moving the ball quickly with this early form of handball, the forerunner of our present passes. South won the flag 15 years later in 1933. It was runners-up for the following 3 seasons, bridesmaid again in 1945, and thereafter battled to achieve earlier glory. After 2 solid years in the VFL, University continued to improve, and late in the 1910 season, the students looked a distinct chance to contest the finals for the first time since entering the league competition 2 years earlier. But in the run home, University's chances slipped dramatically when the club lost 5 out of the last 6 games to end the season in 6th position. Collingwood ended up winning its 3rd flag by beating Carlton by 14 points in the grand final. A year later, in 1911, the sensational news was the players' strike by St Kilda, who were displeased that they weren't provided with dressing room tickets for their friends. The situation worsened when senior players openly feuded with committee men over the management of the club's affairs. The problem climaxed when, in round 14, the players almost didn't take the field. A week later, only 6 regular footballers stripped at Princes Park. The remainder of the positions were filled by second-raters, part-time players and juniors. Needless to say, Carlton won the match by 114 points. While the St Kilda rumpus continued, Essendon, coached by former Carlton great Jack Worrell, won the flag. 1912 was again Essendon's year, even though the club finished 3rd at the end of the home and away series. And the Dons, magnificently coached by Worrell, did it the hard way. They squeezed home by 2 goals against South Melbourne in the second semi, slipped past Carlton the week later by 4 points, then recorded a 14-point win over South in the grand final. 1913 marked the start of an incredible period of Collingwood history. It was the year Jock McHale was appointed coach of the club. It was a tenure which spanned 38 years to 1950 and included 8 premierships and 25 finals appearances in a massive 762 games. 1913 also denoted a dramatic improvement in the stocks of the St Kilda Football Club, which enjoyed its best season since joining the VFL in 1897. The Saints chalked up 11 victories and moved into its first grand final berth after overcoming South Melbourne in the first semi and Fitzroy in the penultimate final. But stage fright hit the St Kilda players in the big game in front of 60,000 spectators, and the Maroon Unbeatables won the grand final by 13 points. VFL matches continued to provide the population with exciting times, but when war was declared in August of 1914, the escalating hostilities signalled a major decline in the progress of the game. As World War I intensified, attendances dropped by up to 60%, and the competition was thrown into turmoil. Young men and women enlisted, and every aspect of life altered, including the importance of football, which now became a diversion rather than a passion. Men were so scarce in 1916 that the VFL had a token competition between 4 clubs: Carlton, Collingwood, Fitzroy and Richmond. And the matches were more exhibitions than win-at-all-costs affairs. Geelong and South Melbourne rejoined the league in 1917 to join Carlton, Collingwood, Richmond and Fitzroy, which meant the teams now met each other 3 times for a total of 15 rounds. 12 months later, Essendon and St Kilda came back to the VFL, leaving Melbourne as the only club in recess. South Melbourne lost just 1 game for the season to St Kilda when the Saints' Dave McNamara, who is credited with kicking the ball 96 metres in practice, booted all his side's 3 first-quarter goals. South improved as the season unfolded, however, and went on to win its second pennant by overrunning Collingwood in the grand final. Round 2 of the 1919 season was a memorable one for St Kilda supporters because the team finally beat Collingwood at Victoria Park after 25 unsuccessful attempts. But the hoodoo wasn't overcome, and the Saints didn't win at Collingwood again until 1962, 43 years later. St Kilda, however, suffered another inglorious defeat in 1919, this time to South, who beat the hapless Saints by 171 points, a record margin which stood for 60 years. South's victory included an incredible record of 17 goals for in the final term. But despite that percentage booster, South's attempts to win back-to-back flags was lost when Richmond beat them in the first semi. Richmond continued on to the grand final, but was led all the way in the grand final by the Magpies, who won their 5th premiership. The following year, 1920, was, however, finally Richmond's. The club won its first premiership since joining the VFL 12 years earlier, after losing only 2 of 16 games. The team repeated the performance in 1921, when it added another premiership trophy to its cabinet by beating Carlton by 4 points. 1922 was Fitzroy's year, when it won its 7th title. But the Maroons weren't as fortunate the next season, when Essendon's Mosquito Fleet won the grand final on October the 20th, the latest finish to a league season, which was caused by heavy rain. Essendon's mighty midgets proudly took the flag to Windy Hill in only their 2nd year there. And the reason behind the team's nickname? Simple. 8 of its players stood just 168 centimetres. That is a mere 5 feet 6. In 1924, Essendon again topped the ladder at the end of the home and away season, and in ludicrous circumstances won the premiership despite being defeated by Richmond in the last final. The VFL had foolishly decided to revert back to the old final system, whereby the 4 top teams played each other, and the premiership team was decided on percentage. Instead of celebrating their dubious success, the Essendon players fought amongst themselves in the dressing rooms after losing to Richmond.
The arguments and dissatisfaction that took place following this match caused our leading player and the player of the year, Tom Fitzmaurice, to get out.
2 important events occurred which were of enormous significance to the VFL. Firstly, VFA champion Footscray enhanced its chances of entering the VFL when it beat League Premiers Essendon for the Championship of Victoria. The other interesting news from 1924 was the institution of the Brownlow Medal. The medal, named after Charles Brownlow, Geelong's secretary of 35 years, was made from gold enamel and valued at the princely sum of £10. Fittingly, Geelong centreman Cargie Greaves won the inaugural medal when he polled 7 votes. The first dual winner of the Brownlow was Melbourne's Ivor Warne-Smith, who won the award in 1926 and 1928. He was 30 years old when he won his second medal. Cargie Greaves was runner-up to Warne-Smith both those years. Collingwood's first medalist was big man Sid Coventry in 1927. All through 1924, rumours persisted that the VFL was keen to introduce another team to overcome the problem of having a weekly bye in the 9-club competition. the league procrastinated until January the 9th, 1925, when Footscray, Hawthorn and North Melbourne were invited to join the league, and overnight the VFL grew from 9 to 12 clubs. North was the only new VFL club to be successful in the opening round of the exciting new competition when it downed Geelong by 8 points. But Geelong lost only one more game for the home and away series and went on to win the grand final against Collingwood by 10 points. In 1926, it was Melbourne's turn to shatter the dreams of the Black and White Army. The Redlegs recorded a resounding 10-goal win and were the only side until North Melbourne in 1975 to win the flag from third position. But Jock McHale's Magpies were on the verge of dominating the competition like no other team. Collingwood reeled off 4 premierships in succession, a feat which is unlikely to be equalled. The first came in one of the lowest scoring grand finals in history, when Collingwood won the 27 flag by beating Richmond 2-13 to 1-7. And it was a big year for the Coventry brothers. Gordon kicked 97 goals for the season, a new VFL record, and Sid won the Brownlow. Gordon Coventry was again in sensational form in the 28 grand final when he booted 9 goals against the hapless Richmond. Fitzroy would have gladly swapped most of its forward line for Coventry because in round 6 against Geelong, the Maroons kicked an unbelievable 2-27. The Magpies were unstoppable during the 1929 season and remained undefeated after the 18 home and away matches. Spearhead Coventry became the first player to crack the 100-goal barrier by kicking 124 for the year, including 16 against Hawthorn in round 13. Although Richmond inflicted Collingwood's first loss for the season in the second semi-final, Jock McHale's team reversed the result in the grand final. A year later, 1930, the Magpies finished on top of the ladder for the 5th consecutive season and demonstrated their brilliance by beating Geelong in the grand final. And McHale wasn't even at the ground. He was confined to bed with the flu as his team marched to its 4th flag on the trot. Collingwood was in line to win its 3rd premiership in a row when the club lined up against Geelong in the grand final. The Cats had won the previous 13 matches, but at half-time the teams were locked together in a tremendous exhibition of football. However, Geelong finished the stronger by beating 6-1 in the final quarter to win the match by 32 points. The grand final was also significant because it marked the last match for Collingwood's legendary Gordon Coventry, who turned 36 on the day of the big match. Earlier in the season, he'd been the first VFL player to chalk up 300 games, and during his magnificent 17-year career, Coventry kicked 1,299 goals, a record in 306 matches for an average of just over 4 goals a match. Round 13 in 1938 was probably the most exciting in league history because there were 4 one-point results. By the time Carlton and Collingwood lined up for the grand final, interest in league football was at its peak, and the largest crowd ever to see a football match in Australia, 96,384, were shoehorned into the MCG. The Blues' pre-match tactics played a vital part in the club's victory. Carlton was aware that Magpie skipper Albert Collier was carrying a leg injury into the game, and to ensure he remained on the field and not replaced by a fit player, the Blues were instructed not to bump him. Collier was a liability and finished the game limping badly, while 19th man Carmody remained on the bench. The other impressive tactic was the decision to position Carlton's half-forwards, Schmidt and Sophie Valance, who was playing his last game, wide, to allow the Blues to attack through Jack Rout at centre half-forward. The match was a fierce contest, and after the initial softening up period in the first quarter, the Blues led by a point. Carlton, with 4 quick goals in the closing 5 minutes of the second quarter, gave the Blues a 20-point half-time advantage. Despite some desperate play by the Magpies, which saw them get to within 4 points after Ron Todd goal, the Carlton players rose to the challenge, and the VFL Premiership pennant headed to Princes Park for the first time in 23 years. In 1939, St Kilda enjoyed its first final success since 1913 when they defeated Richmond in the first semi-final. But in the preliminary final, they had no answer to Collingwood full forward Ron Todd, who kicked 11 goals and led his team into the grand final where Melbourne was waiting. The Magpies started brilliantly with 6 goals in the first quarter, but Melbourne hit back hard to lead by 4 points at half-time. After the interval, the Magpies managed only 4 goals, while the Demons piled on 11 to win their 3rd premiership. On reflection, it was a sad grand final because 3 members of the Melbourne premiership team, Keith Bluey Truscott, Harry Ball and wingman Sid Anderson, were killed in action during the Second World War, a war declared shortly before the end of the season. The trio were among 37 VFL players to be killed. Time 1940 rolled around, VFL football had lapsed into an unpredictable competition because of the number of young men entering the services. At the end of the home and away series, Melbourne occupied top spot on the ladder after dropping just 4 games during the season. Although Richmond defeated the Demons in the first semi-final, Melbourne reversed the result in the grand final. Melbourne, hit hard by injuries, were unable to name its grand final side until just before the start of play. On the sodden ground, Melbourne started well and held a commanding 7-goal lead at half-time. Richmond made numerous positional changes at three-quarter time, and although 2 quick goals narrowed the gap, Norm Smith continued to kick accurately and ended the match with 7 goals. The war had a devastating effect on league football in 1941, and very few footballers were available for selection. However, both wartime Prime Ministers, Menzies and Curtin, maintained that sport would boost morale. Attendances dropped by an average of 66,000 a week, and in 1942, Geelong pulled out of the competition because of wartime travel restrictions, leaving the VFL with a bye each week. Melbourne, which won the premiership in 1939, 1940 and 41, dropped to 8th spot on the ladder following the retirement of its great coach, Checker Hughes. Essendon won the premiership in 1942, Richmond was successful in 1943, Fitzroy in 44 and Carlton in 1945. Many people believed the victories were hollow ones because of the war-torn competition, but their comments didn't impress the supporters of these clubs. Many supporters also weren't too impressed with the 45 grand final between the Blues and South Melbourne, a match which will be forever known as the Bloodbath. To give an indication of how tough some of the Carlton players were was the fact that club captain Bob Chitty played in the match despite chopping off one of his fingers at work. The South players were promised the massive sum of £20 a man for a win, an enormous incentive for any player in that era. The match was fast and furious from the opening bounce at Prince's Oval. Kicking with the wind, Carlton could only manage 1 goal in the first 15 minutes, and the team looked most unimpressive. South, through Smith and Nash, kicked 2 early goals in the second quarter, but then the grand final erupted into violence. Chitty flattened South's Ron Clegg, and shortly after, his teammate Billy Williams hit the deck after being fixed up by Chitty. Price then goaled for Carlton, but as the ball was being relayed back to the centre, Carlton's Ken Hands was KO'd as 63,000 fans called for blood and an all-in brawl developed. The final quarter began with a bang when Chitty was dropped. Players, trainers, ambulance men and officials converged onto the field and police had to break up the fight. Carlton ended up winning the match. Then umpires spent 2 hours filling out their report sheets. 10 players appeared before the tribunal and only 2 escaped suspension. The remaining 8 players were suspended for a total of 75 weeks, an average of 9 per player. First genuine superstar, and for the first time in the history of the game, many spectators simply went to matches to watch him play, even though they had no allegiance to the Bombers. In his debut season, Coleman booted 100 goals and was the man who guided Essendon to its record grand final win against Carlton. Essendon's superiority continued in 1950, and with Coleman kicking another century of goals, the Bombers charged through the season with 17 wins from 18 matches. Predictably, Essendon won the grand final against North Melbourne, and Coleman's 4 goals took his 2-season tally with Essendon to an amazing 220 goals. But 1951 dealt Coleman a crushing blow. In the last home and away match, he was suspended for 4 matches for striking Carlton's Harry Casper and was suspended for 4 games. Hundreds of fans stood outside Harrison House for the verdict, and when they saw Coleman emerge with tears streaming down his face, they knew the worst had happened. Their hero was to miss the grand final. The Bombers plunged from favourites for their 3rd successive flag to rank outsiders. That was an indication of Coleman's value to the side. Geelong seized on the advantage to beat the Bombers and thus win its first premiership in 14 years. The Cats' Bernie Smith capped off a great year by winning the Brownlow medal. The Cats, led by the likes of Bob Davis, were again dominant in 1952 and thrashed Collingwood by 46 points in the grand final. The Cats again made the grand final in 1953, but failed to win a hat-trick of flags when Collingwood took the match by only 2 goals. 1954 was Footscray's year. In fact, it remains the club's only premiership when it crushed Melbourne by 51 points. The era from 1955 to 1958 belonged to 2 teams, Melbourne and Collingwood. 55 marked the start of the Demons' golden run of flags. With a star-studded lineup, the Demons beat the Magpies in the 1955 and 56 grand finals. In 1957, Hawthorn temporarily grabbed the limelight by playing in its first finals series since joining the VFL in 1925. Led brilliantly by ruckman John Kennedy, the Hawks beat Carlton in the first semi-final by 23 points in atrocious conditions. But the Hawks' run crashed in the preliminary final when Melbourne humbled the precocious newcomers by 68 points to become hot favourites to emulate Collingwood's performance of 1927 through until 30 in winning 4 premierships in a row. Once again, the Demons faced their arch-rivals Collingwood in the big match. Melbourne kicked 5 goals to 2 in the opening quarter and a 4th consecutive flag looked a formality. But in the second quarter, a 98,000-strong crowd sensed Melbourne was starting to wilt under the fierce, hard-hitting Magpies, who had Barry, Hooker, Harrison, roughing out Barassi and Wiedemann, doing likewise to Mithun. An explosive third term saw Melbourne slip out of the game after Collingwood kicked 5 unanswered goals to take a 33-point lead into the final quarter. Although the Magpies kicked only 1 point in the final term, the Collingwood defence, led superbly by Sullivan and Reeves, limited the Demons to 2 goals, and the Pies rejoiced their 13th premiership victory. Clearly, its greatest. Essendon. It was the Demons' 4th premiership of the 50s, and they were clear favourites to win the first grand final of the 60s too. The preliminary final between Collingwood, the Demons' great foe, and Fitzroy was one of the most exciting in years. Playing in mud and slush, both teams showed the form which many believed would upset the Demons in the grand final a week later. Scores between the Magpies and the Lions were close all day, but Beers kicked a behind to put the Magpies a point in front late in the game, and then Rover Burns' goal to enable Collingwood to grab a 7-point lead. Fitzroy peppered the goals, but managed only 2 behinds to give Collingwood a hard-fought 5-point victory. After Collingwood's slog in the preliminary final, Melbourne was rightly confident of winning yet another premiership. Conditions for the big match were terrible, and the Demons took advantage of their lethargic opponents by kicking 4-3-0 in the first quarter. The Magpies' first major score didn't come until the 3-minute mark of the second quarter, and by half-time, Melbourne held a commanding lead. The Demons added another 3 goals for the match, while Collingwood kicked only 1, and the team's total of 2 goals, 2 behinds remains the lowest grand final score since the formation of the league. 1961 signalled the breaking of the league's finals monopoly when St Kilda, Hawthorn and Footscray joined Melbourne in the 4. Apart from the perennial grand finalist Melbourne, only Footscray had won a flag in 1954. The Bulldogs, led by captain-coach Ted Whitten, ended the finals hopes of both St Kilda and Melbourne. The Hawks had earlier moved into the grand final by finishing too strongly for Melbourne in the second semi-final. So, for the first time, 2 clubs who'd been admitted to the VFL in 1925 played off in the grand final. At half-time, the pacey Bulldogs held a slender lead, but Hawthorn, with skipper Graham Harper and centreman Brendan Edwards providing plenty of drive, kicked 6 goals 6 in the third quarter to grab a 27-point lead at the last change. John Kennedy's super-fit Chargers added another 4 goals in the final quarter to win its first premiership by 43 points. Kennedy, in only his second year at the helm, was the mastermind behind the memorable victory. 1962 turned out to be a monumental year for the VFL, which bought 212 acres of land in Waverley as a development site for a world-class stadium for the home of league football. 62 was also Neil Roberts' last year as St Kilda captain. The Saints, after making the finals the year before in Alan Jean's first year as coach, could only finish 6th on the ladder. In this match between St Kilda and Hawthorn, Jeans was opposed to John Kennedy, one of the earliest clashes between these 2 men who were to become coaching legends. Another great league personality was North Melbourne's Alan Aylett, who became the first Roo to play 200 games. Aylett won North's best and fairest in 1958, 59 and 60, but tasted little success in his playing days. That came in the mid-70s when, as president of North, he guided the Roos to their first premiership. In the early 1960s, with television elevating league footballers to larger-than-life characters, many cult heroes were spawned and worshipped, and some of the big names would do anything for publicity. Take Collingwood skipper Murray Wiedemann. He decided to take up wrestling, much to the delight of Magpie supporters as well as his opposition followers, who were happy to see the weed on his back for a change. Another of the VFL's biggest draw cards was 17-year-old St Kilda recruit Carl Ditterich. The fiercely competitive Brighton High School student captured the imagination of the footballing public, although some believed he was excessively exuberant on the field.
Carl, lately you've been sort of branded as a bad man. What do you feel about this label? Do you think this label fits?
I don't know. It's just that it's my view or my aim to play football. That's the only way I can play football. I can't adopt it any other way. I've been playing like that ever since I can remember.
Another player who wasn't short on aggression was Hawthorn full forward John Peck, who became the most wanted man in Adelaide after he flattened South Australian defender Brian Sawley in the interstate game in 1963. But one man who didn't have a habit of upsetting the umpires was South Melbourne's Bob Skilton, who won his second Brownlow in 63 by 3 votes from Geelong's Polly Farmer and St Kilda's Darryl Baldock. In the grand final of that year, Geelong, coached by former champion Bob Davis, won the club's first flag since 1952 by cruising to an easy victory over Hawthorn. In 1964, an injured Ron Barassi became coach for a day, while Norm Smith was in Adelaide coaching the Victorian team. And Barassi showed he was no slouch from the sidelines by orchestrating the Demons' 67-point victory over Fitzroy. Another coach in the news during the 1964 season was Essendon's John Coleman, who decided his players needed a bit of help during a dust-up during the first semi-final against Geelong. But his intervention didn't help, as the Cats moved into the preliminary final against Collingwood. Geelong was beaten by 4 points, and the Magpies lined up against their great rivals of the 50s, Melbourne, in the grand final. Barassi, who'd missed the entire 1963 final series because of a 4-week suspension, was hell-bent on making his last match with the Demons a memorable one. And what a match it was. With only minutes remaining in the game, Collingwood's gargantuan Ray Gavalik was responsible for one of the most exciting dashes in VFL history. As he charged his way downfield, bouncing the ball wildly, the Collingwood fans went wild. The goal gave Collingwood a 3-point lead, and victory looked imminent. But the Demons refused to give in, and a goal by back pocket Neil Crompton, his first for the season, was the sealer. It was a fitting result for Barassi because he shocked the football world by announcing he was to leave the club he'd served for more than a decade to coach Carlton.
Melbourne have always been great in their thinking, both on and off the field, and they've done things other clubs wouldn't do. They've done big things. Again, on and off the field, and this would be another example of it. I feel that I've given a long service, and I feel fairly good service.
In 1968, Hawthorn's freakish spearhead Peter Hudson hit the headlines during the 16th round when he became the first player since John Coleman in 1952 to kick 100 goals. Hudson needed 4 to reach the milestone, but he made short work of the task by booting them all in the first quarter against Collingwood. 1968 was also a remarkable year for Melbourne wingman Brian Dixon, who became the first Melbourne player to chalk up 250 games, a record broken only last year by Robert Flower. At the end of the season, South Melbourne's Bobby Skilton joined VFL legends Hayden Bunton and Dick Reynolds as the only 3-time winners of the Brownlow medal. But he obviously earned the honour after absorbing plenty of punishment. Ron Barassi, another household name, added yet another string to his bow by coaching Carlton to a premiership win against Essendon in only his 4th year with the Blues. The match was a nail-biter for most of the afternoon, and even though the Blues didn't kick a goal in the final quarter, their 5 behinds ensured victory. And after 72 years of league football, another first was produced in the match. It was the only time the losing grand final team had kicked more goals than the victors. The Bombers booted 8 goals 5, 3 points shy of Carlton's 7-14. Geelong's Doug Wade kicked 100 goals for the first time in his career during the encounter against Footscray in 1969. He achieved the feat 5 years later, this time with North Melbourne. 69 was also the year Fitzroy's 31-year-old skipper Kevin Murray became one of the most popular winners of the Brownlow medal, 14 years after he joined the Lions. A year later, 1970, the VFL season was extended to 22 rounds, and sides now played each other twice during the year, for the first time since 1924. In the opening round, Richmond and Fitzroy turned on a blue-blooded performance for royalty, with the Lions causing an upset by beating the reigning premier. Fitzroy had moved to the Junction Oval and didn't have much success in the second round of the season when they played host to St Kilda at their new home. Ironically, the Saints' 110-point win was bigger than any they had enjoyed during the 64 years it was their home base. Round 3 of the 1970 season was a special one for the league because their showpiece, VFL Park, was ready to host its first match. Contested between Fitzroy and Geelong, and it was the Cats who recorded an historic victory. In round 5, a fortnight later, the spotlight was at the Western Oval, where Mr Football Ted Whitten played his 321st and last game for Footscray.
Well, Ted, how does it feel to be walking down this lane, approaching the ground for your last game?
Feels bloody awful, David.
Does it?
I don't feel very happy about it at all.
You've been in front all day and you've got to stay there. Are you going to sit there? Come on, then. I want a big effort.
By the end of the season, Collingwood and Carlton had emerged as the dominant teams, and the grand final was one of the VFL's most remarkable matches. A record crowd of 121,696 watched the Magpies build up a seemingly unbeatable 44-point lead at half-time, and thoughts of the last flag in 1958 came flooding back to the black and white army. But at half-time, Carlton coach Barassi took an enormous gamble by insisting his players hand pass at all costs, and introduced reserve Ted Hopkins onto the ground. Hopkins fired up his teammates, and by three-quarter time, the margin had been whittled down to just 17 points. The Blues' onslaught continued in the final term, and they kicked 5 goals to 1 to steal the match by 10 points in one of the truly great VFL fightbacks.
The start of the 1971 season also saw one of the VFL's most talked-about swaps. The Saints let dual Brownlow medalist Ian Stewart go to Richmond in return for Billy Barrett. Another North player was in the news in the early part of the 71 season. His name, Keith Gregg, and he burst into the Victorian team after just 8 senior games. Melbourne also signed a big-name player, but Diamond Jim Tilbrook was an expensive buy for Melbourne, who shelled out $39,000 for the South Australian. There were plenty of fireworks through the season, and the television cameras didn't miss many of them. One which caused particular uproar was the collision between Victoria's Lee Matthews and West Australian idol Barry Cable during the state match in Perth. At the end of the home and away series, 3 of football's biggest names decided to retire. Ron Barassi left Carlton, Bob Rose called it quits after a heartbreaking period with the Magpies, and Norm Smith retired from his coaching role at South Melbourne after a career which spanned 4 decades, highlighted by the halcyon days at Melbourne, in which he was part of 9 premierships. The 1971 grand final was contested between Hawthorn and St Kilda, and a lot of interest centred on whether the Hawks' goal-kicking machine, Peter Hudson, could break Bob Pratt's record of 150 goals. Hudson needed 4 to break the record, which had stood since 1934. In one of the most fiercely contested grand finals in history, Hudson had his chances, but managed only 3 goals, and Pratt's feat was now shared. Hawthorn produced a magical final term to kick 7 goals to 3, and the Hawks, mainly through Bob Keddy, who kicked 4 of them, won its 2nd ever flag. But Hawthorn's dominance took a nosedive in the opening round of the 72 season, when Hudson, who had booted 8 of his team's 9 goals just before half-time, collided with Melbourne's Barry Burke, and the brilliant Tasmanian missed the following 22 months. 1972 saw the introduction of the Final 5 system, and, for the first time, finals matches were played at VFL Park. The elimination in which Richmond and Carlton clashed, we had a draw, only the 5th time in a finals match. A dark side to the exciting match was the attack on field umpire Ian Coates as he walked from the field. In the replay, the Tigers charged into the grand final with a 41-point win, and after the Blues narrowly beat St Kilda, they met Richmond in the grand final, the 3rd time they'd met within a month. This time, it was the Blues' turn, and in a hard-fought match, Carlton kicked the highest score ever in a grand final, while the Tigers' losing tally of 22 goals 18 would have won any previous grand final. But if Carlton thought the grand final was tough, it was nothing compared to the Australian Team Championship in Adelaide a week later, when big bad Mal Brown went on a one-man demolition exercise on the Blues. A few years later, Brown moved to Victoria to play for the Tigers, and he certainly didn't mind throwing his considerable weight around in the VFL competition. 1973 saw the introduction of the 10-year rule, in which automatic clearances were granted to players who'd served a decade with a VFL club. North Melbourne, who had lured coach Ron Barassi out of retirement, also snared Geelong's Doug Wade, South Melbourne's John Rantel, and Essendon's Barry Davis. Another big name to change clubs was St Kilda's Carl Ditterich, who went from being a saint to a demon for more than $60,000. North, with its Foreign Legion, issued an early warning that they were no longer the easy beats of the league when they beat Hawthorn in the first round. South Melbourne also gave their loyal supporters something to cheer about in round 14, when the club ended a 29-match losing streak by beating Geelong. On August the 25th, 1973, Hawthorn full forward Peter Hudson flew by helicopter to VFL Park for his first match since seriously injuring his knee in the opening round of the 72 season. Although overweight, Hudson kicked 8 goals in a wonderful comeback. The grand final was fought out by Richmond and Carlton for the 2nd successive year, but the Tigers reversed the result to give Tom Hafey his 3rd premiership as coach. The match was a hard-hitting affair with some big names, in particular Blues captain coach John Nichols hitting the deck. Richmond ruckman Neil Baum also made sure Jeff Southby and Vin Waite earned their kicks. In 1974, North continued its relentless recruiting drive and landed the signatures of the brilliant pair of Barry Cable and Malcolm Blight. Meanwhile, Richmond signed WA's infamous Mal Brown, and he didn't take long to renew acquaintances with Carlton's John Nichols, who later in the year broke Ted Whitten's VFL games record of 321 matches. One of the most shameful occurrences of the 70s was the brawl which erupted just before half-time in the match at Windy Hill between the Bombers and Richmond.
Mal Brown was suspended for 1 match for assault. Richmond's Stephen Parsons was suspended for 4 matches. Ron Andrews received 6 matches. Essendon physical education instructor Jim Bradley got 6 matches. Essendon runner Laurie Ashley got 6 weeks. And Essendon rover John Casson got off on a striking charge.
The Roos reached their first grand final since 1950 when they clashed with Richmond. The Tigers, with far greater experience, became the first team since Melbourne in 1959-60 to win back-to-back flags. And Tom Hafey's side was regarded as one of the greatest modern-day combinations. But North had signalled they too would be a force to be reckoned with and were regular finalists for the following 6 years. 1975 marked the introduction of colour television, and football became tremendously popular. It also marked the debuts of one of league football's most colourful personalities, Collingwood's Phil Carman. The brilliant South Australian was dubbed Fabulous after booting 11 goals against St Kilda in round 20, and the white boots he donned for the occasion typified the outrageous Carman character. At the end of the season, Footscray celebrated the Brownlow medal win of ruckman Gary Dempsey, who became the first Bulldog since John Schultz in 1960 to win football's most coveted individual award. North Melbourne then achieved history by winning its first premiership and overcoming Hawthorn in an emotional grand final before more than 110,000 fans. The Roos led at every chain, and a brilliant final term which netted Ron Barassi's men 7 goals gave North the biggest grand final win since 1957 when Melbourne crushed Essendon. 1976 saw the introduction of the two-umpire system in an effort to enable the men in white to keep up with the increasing tempo of the game. Although there was some early confusion, the move developed into a successful one. One of the most memorable matches of the season was between North Melbourne and Carlton in the 10th round. The brilliant Malcolm Blight kicked 3 goals for the Roos in time on, and he had the ball at least 60 metres from goal when the siren sounded, with his team trailing by a point. No one gave him a chance, but he unleashed one of the longest kicks for goal, and a jubilant North team flocked to carry its hero from the ground. There were plenty of fireworks during the year, and St Kilda's Robert Muir featured in many of them. The fiery Saint was a gifted footballer, but he struggled to harness his fiery temperament, and during his checkered career, Muir was a regular visitor to VFL House. Come grand final time, and it was North Melbourne and Hawthorn for the second year in a row. Apart from desperately wanting to make amends for the shocking performance they put up in the 75 grand final, there was a tragic reason the Hawks wanted to crush the Roos. Their skipper, Peter Crimmins, was gravely ill with cancer, and every player in the brown and gold dedicated themselves to win the match for their little mate. John Kennedy's Chargers lived up to their promise, and on September the 28th, 3 days after the grand final, Crimmins lost his fight for life.
Caught with the hand pass out towards Crimmins. Crimmins going for the bounce. Find it a bit slippery. Here's a chance now for Crimmins. Zone at a mark. Has been paid to Peter Hudson. We'll wait on the result of this. Punched away by Rollins. Picked up by Crimmins. Crimmins going for the left foot. And there's Hudson all by himself. I one out towards Crimmins and Roden. And Crimmins takes the mark. Plays on straight away and left foots it for a goal.
VFL Park lit up on May 17 of the 1977 season, and one of the all-time greats, Royce Hart, called it a day 2 months later after a magnificent career with the Tigers which spanned a decade. Carlton's normally unflappable Bruce Doull lost his cool in this match against Hawthorn, but he didn't have to pay the price of Collingwood's Phil Carman, who clocked Hawk Michael Tuck in the second semi-final, and the subsequent 2-week suspension caused him to miss the grand final. For the first time, the grand final was telecast live, and more than 1 million people watched as the Magpies built up a commanding lead by three-quarter time. The difference at the last break was almost 5 goals, and Collingwood, which the year before had won the wooden spoon, looked set for an easy win. But the Roos kicked 5-7 to 1-4 in the breathtaking final term, and when the siren sounded, scores were locked together, and the stunned players slumped to the ground in disbelief. A week later, it was all North, and Ron Barassi's team led at every change to inflict yet another heartbreaking defeat upon the long-suffering Magpie Army. The early part of the 1978 season was marred by constant sniping by St Kilda and Essendon players, and legal action ensued after players from both sides hit the deck. On July the 1st, Footscray kicked a record score of 33 goals, 15, 213 points, with Kelvin Templeton booting 15 goals, the most number kicked by a player for a decade. There were plenty of memorable bumps during the season, but there was no question that this one, in which Keith Gregg was shirt-fronted by Geelong's Ray Card, was the best of the year. Carlton's Percy Jones provided some of the most light-hearted moments of 78, and Peter Crackers Keenan took the award for the Punch of the Year, but my back hurts. This indiscretion against Hawk Don Scott cost Keenan a place in the grand final team. The Roos and Hawthorn met for the 3rd time in 4 years in the grand final. The Hawks, through Moncrief, booted 2 goals in the opening minutes, but in the second quarter, North bounced back and led by 4 points at half-time after Baker kicked 4 goals in just 20 minutes. North then moved 2 goals clear early in the 3rd quarter, but the Hawks, inspired by Captain Scott, answered the challenge to boot 7 goals in the term, then put the nail in the Roos coffin by adding another 4 in the last quarter to win by 3 goals and give former player David Parkin his first premiership as a coach. Series between Hawthorn and Claremont at VFL Park, the players had to adapt quickly to the slippery conditions when the sprinkler system was activated. The Hawks adapted the better and won the match by 3 goals. And if that was a strange occurrence, what about North Melbourne's replacement for the galloping gasometer, Mick Nolan? Carlton's Percy Jones, playing in the reserves against the Hawks, didn't do much for his chance of promotion when he put his foot in it as he attempted to goal. In round 17 of the 79 season, Fitzroy played some of its best ever football in kicking a VFL record of 36 goals, 22, 238 to Melbourne's 612, 48. The Lions booted 7 goals in each of the first 2 quarters, 12 in the third, and finished off with 10 in the final quarter to chalk up a percentage-boosting 190-point victory. There was no question who took out the bump of the year. Collingwood's Stan Magro made sure the Blues' Alex Jesselenko hit the deck hard in this shirt front. The 1979 Brownlow medal winner was Magro's teammate Peter Moore, but his dream season crashed later in the week when the Pies came up against Carlton in the grand final. After booting 5 goals in the third term, the Blues looked headed for an easy win, but the Collingwood players fought back, and with 15 minutes to go, the margin had been sliced to only 4 points. Carlton's captain-coach Jesselenko was carried off injured, and it was left to Wayne Harms to produce a magic moment during the desperate battle. After miskicking the ball, he charged after it, and just as it was about to cross the boundary line, he smashed it back in field to Ken Sheldon, who goaled to ensure a narrow win. But the jubilation at Princes Park was short-lived after an internal feud over the summer months split the proud club. Jesselenko was dumped as coach and, after 2 rounds of the 1980 season, replaced St Kilda's coach Mike Patterson. The aforementioned Percy Jones took over the reins at Carlton. In the final home and away match of the 1980 season, Richmond dropped from top spot to third after being beaten by the Swans. Geelong took over at the head of the ladder for the first time since 1954. But the Cats lost both finals matches, and the grand final was contested by the Tigers and Collingwood, which became the only team in history to reach the big match from 5th position. But the Magpies' 4 finals matches prior to the grand final took their toll, and the Tigers recorded the largest ever grand final victory. The margin was a mammoth 81 points, and veteran Kevin Bartlett, in his 339th match, booted 7 goals for Richmond. During the 81 season, all eyes were on Kevin Cheaty's Bombers, who strung together 15 wins on the trot after winning just 1 of the opening 6 matches. In fact, after 6 rounds, Essendon was in 10th position. The Bombers' 15 victories was the longest winning run since Collingwood's 18 in 1929. But it was all to no avail because Essendon lost to Geelong in the last home and away match of the year, then was bundled out of the finals a week later by Fitzroy. Just before the finals started, however, the VFL was thrown into all sorts of confusion when the umpires went on strike before the 19th round. It caused all sorts of problems, but the round was completed after reserve and under-19 umpires were urgently pressed into service. The grand final of 81 held special significance because Collingwood needed to beat Carlton, otherwise the Magpies' premiership record of 13 would be equalled. Late in the third quarter, the Collingwood record looked safe when they grabbed a 21-point lead. But from that point on, the Blues finished all over their tired opponents, and for the first time since 1915, the Blues shared the premiership record with their arch-rivals. The summer of 81 was dominated by the acrimonious debate as to whether South Melbourne should be relocated to Sydney. Eventually, the move succeeded, and halfway through the year, the club was renamed the Swans. Collingwood coach Tom Hafey didn't even make it to the halfway point of the season because he was sacked after the Magpies lost 8 matches in a row. In the very same week, Footscray's coach Royce Hart was also given his marching orders. Collingwood, grand finalists a year earlier, finished in 10th position in 82, the greatest fall of any club. Richmond, in Francis Burke's debut year as coach, reached the grand final with a minimum of fuss and were raging favourites to take out the premiership. But the Blues had other ideas, and their 3-goal win was a personal triumph for coach David Parkin, who became the first coach since Dan Minogue in 1920 and 21 to win successive flags in his first 2 years at a club. His Sydney teammate, Paul Morwood, ran out with the Saints, even though he didn't have a permit to play in the red, white and black colours. There was more controversy at VFL Park later in the year when the night grand final was postponed because of the poor condition of the ground. During the season, the once dominant Victorian team was humbled when beaten in both State of Origin matches. In the game against South Australia, one of the most damaging players for the Crow Eaters was John Platten, who continued his fine form after crossing to Hawthorn in 1986. The 83 season also saw one of the most fiery outbursts over umpiring following the spiteful match between Essendon and Carlton. The Bombers' Kevin Sheedy was particularly forthright.
It is a waste of time Monday night. I honestly believe that.
So was Carlton's David Parkin.
I had two players, one Essendon and one Carlton player, then reported for the most frivolous acts I've ever seen on a football field.
Controversial Mark Jackson created a record of sorts by being sacked by St Kilda, his 3rd VFL club, all by the ripe old age of 23. Richmond's Kevin Bartlett didn't have such problems, and he achieved a milestone by playing his 400th game with the Tigers, his only club. In the qualifying final between Fitzroy and Hawthorn, the Lions almost caused a boil-over by rattling home in the final quarter, thanks largely to champion full forward Bernie Quinlan, who was virtually unstoppable late in the match. But the Hawks hit their straps in the following weeks, and in the grand final they played Essendon. Ironically, the first time the two clubs had met in a final. But what a disappointment the match turned out to be. The Bombers' gruelling run to the big match had taken its toll, and Hawthorn annihilated Kevin Sheedy's men by a record 83 points. Essendon's morale received a temporary boost at the start of the 84 season, when ex-skipper Neil Danaher made a comeback at the Lake Oval after a series of heartbreaking knee operations. During the season, the Hawthorn cheer squad was kept busy because Captain Lee Matthews and fullback Kelvin Moore both joined the illustrious 300 Club. Hawthorn and Essendon created a first when they clashed in the first Sunday finals match, the second semi-final. The Hawks again proved to be the Bombers' nemesis, but disaster was looming for the men in brown and gold. A fortnight later in the grand final, Essendon produced a stunning last quarter to turn a three-quarter time deficit of 23 points into a 4-goal triumph. The Bombers really made Hawthorn pay for the 1983 disgrace, and the 9-goal six kicked in the final term was a grand final record, and Essendon won its first premiership for 18 years. The 85 season was dominated by flamboyant Sydney medico Geoffrey Edelston, who became the first owner of a VFL team when he purchased the Sydney Swans for $4 million. While the good doctor was commanding saturation media coverage, Footscray unobtrusively went about its business to make the finals for the first time since 1976. In the preliminary final, however, the hopes of the entire western suburbs was cruelly crushed when the Hawks came from behind to snatch the game by 10 points and move into their third successive grand final. But if Essendon was in great form in the 84 grand final, the players were in devastating touch in the corresponding match a year later. The Bombers crushed Hawthorn by kicking 11 goals in the last quarter, eclipsing their record in the 84 match and going to within 5 points of breaking the Hawks' record winning grand final margin. In winning the premiership, Essendon equalled Carlton's record of 14 flags. During the 1986 season, the disgraceful practice of eye gouging was caught by the cameras, particularly in this match between Essendon and the Swans. But while the Bombers and the Swans were eye gouging, Sydney full forward Warwick Capper was eye catching when he released his first record, complete with video and beautiful friends. Over in Western Australia, big bad Mal Brown was also keeping his name in the headlines when he led Perth off the field because he was unhappy with the umpiring. When asked for a comment, Mal was emphatic. There would be no interview.
Why'd you pull him off? Have you spoken to the umpire yet? Perhaps the big coach wanted just a little time to come up with the right answer. Anyway, we got cut off.
VFL General Manager Jack Hamilton, who began his career at the league in 1949, retired, and former St Kilda player Ross Oakley was later appointed as VFL Commissioner. However, before he stepped down, Hamilton was kept busy in trying to find a suitable venue for a Brisbane-based VFL team. Actor Paul Cronin, with the backing of the Queensland Australian Football League, headed the winning syndicate, and the Brisbane Bears entered the expanded competition. Over in Perth, the WAFL also made a momentous decision by opting to become a part of the VFL, and suddenly we had 14 teams. But back to Melbourne, and Footscray Brownlow medalist Brad Hardy had a much publicised disagreement with coach Mick Malthouse after he was dragged from the ground against Carlton at VFL Park. The following year, Hardy was not at the Western Oval. The 1986 Brownlow medal was a tie between Hawthorn strongman Robert Di-Pier-Domenico and Swans prolific ball handler Greg Williams. Actually, it was a big year for the Hawks because Di-Pier-Domenico was his club's first ever medalist, and Hawthorn won the grand final by easily accounting for Carlton by 7 goals. It was Hawthorn's 4th successive appearance in the grand final. Not long after the season finished, St Kilda announced the return of its favourite son, Darryl Baldock, who had finally been coached back to Moorabbin as senior coach. Early in the 87 season, the football world was stunned when Carlton defender Peter Motley was lucky to survive a horrendous car accident as he was driving home from training. Motley's tremendous courage in his fight for life inspired his teammates to go on and win the flag. The Wacko Jacko show moved in Perth, and Mark Jackson, now playing with South Fremantle, decided to take on the entire Swan Districts team. But if Jackson was getting frustrated, what about Richmond's Tony Jewell, who tried to pull out every hair on his head as the Tigers threw away a commanding lead against the Swans? The Saints received a major setback when coach Baldock was taken to hospital after suffering a stroke. But after months of speculation, he returned to Moorabbin at the start of this season. Hawthorn, however, didn't get back its dual premiership coach, Alan Jeans, following delicate brain surgery in November. Team manager Alan Joyce was appointed caretaker coach. And what a job Joyce has done. Not only has he piloted them to top spot on the ladder this year, spearhead Jason Dunstall has booted 100 goals, the first Hawthorn player since Peter Hudson in 1977 to achieve that milestone. Another full forward, however, didn't have any luck. St Kilda's Tony Lockett, the reigning Brownlow medalist, broke his ankle against Footscray at Waverley, and the Saints' form dropped dramatically after their star forward was sidelined. And finally, and on another unfortunate note, the VFL Commission laid charges against 3 players during the year for conduct unbecoming. The first was Melbourne's Rod Grinter, who copped 6 weeks for this incident involving Footscray's Terry Wallace. Essendon skipper Terry Danaher received a 2-week suspended sentence for a crude tackle on Magpie Peter Dacos. And St Kilda's Warren Jones retired after being suspended for 4 matches on 3 separate occasions. In fact, Jones must be the only footballer in history to appear before the VFL tribunal 3 times in 4 days as he tried desperately to clear his name.